Today's speaker is cognitive scientist Anthony Barnhart Ph.D. Besides being the chair of the Department of Psychological Science at Carthage College, where he regularly teaches a college course devoted to the cognitive science of magic, Tony is also a part-time professional magician. He borrows the hypothesis and techniques from magic to study attention and perception in the laboratory, and has authored both empirical and theoretical works on the interface of science and magic. Tony was a founding member of the Science of Magic Association, whose logo is on the right side of the screen, and appears frequently in national and international media. Most recently, his work was featured on an episode of the CBC's The Nature of Things with David Suzuki, and this episode was devoted to the science of magic. Tony, the stage is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Don. Don, would you mind spotlighting me if you haven't done so already?
I just did.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Don, and thanks to Fred for the invitation to speak. I have a long history with humanists. While I live in Kenosha, Wisconsin these days, I spent about a decade in Arizona. And for much of that decade, I was active with the Phoenix Humanists, which is a thriving community of secular humanists. So it feels like I know exactly what I'm getting into coming to speak with you today. Yes, as Don mentioned, feel free to put questions in the chat. I've got the chat open, but I'm very distracted. So Don, feel free to interrupt if anything comes through the chat that you think I should be aware of in the moment. All right, so pro tip before we get going, you should begin every presentation with an image that will both distract from what you're saying and haunt your audience's dreams for weeks to come. And I feel like I've accomplished that here, and you're welcome. I'm excited to tell you today about some of the work that I've been doing in the laboratory over the course of my career, borrowing hypotheses from magicians to test in service of forwarding our understanding of psychology, specifically in the domains of attention and perception, which is right in my wheelhouse. But before we get into that, a little bit more about me. So, as I mentioned, I'm a professor at Carthage College, a small liberal arts college in Kenosha, Wisconsin. I have a couple of research programs. A big part of what I do is studying handwritten word perception. So it doesn't touch on magic at all. I went to graduate school to be a language researcher, in fact. It turns out we know remarkably little about how you're so capable of looking at messy handwritten words in a script you've never seen before, cutting through the noise and finding the signal to know what those words are. So about a third of the work that I do in the lab is in service of better understanding how we accomplish this remarkable perceptual feat of reading handwritten words. But more relevant to today's presentation, I study the science of magic, both borrowing hypotheses from magic to test in the laboratory and borrowing techniques from the world of magic to make my laboratory studies of attention and perception have a little bit of real world flair to them. So how did I get here? I have been a practicing magician for over 30 years now. I paid for college doing magic shows. Here's some evidence that I've been at this far too long. Here I am in the pages of National Geographic World at the age of 15, I think. Yeah, I still have the vest. If you're in the market for a sequin vest sized for a 15-year-old boy, please reach out to me. I used to lecture to magicians on what magicians call outs. One of the beautiful things about magic is that the audience rarely knows where the magician is headed. So if something goes wrong partway through a magic act, a good magician can pivot, can change the trajectory they were on and end with a different magic trick than they started with. And the audience will be none the wiser. This is called an out, what to do when things go wrong. So I hope that you won't see anything go wrong during today's presentation. And if something does go wrong, that you'll be none the wiser. I kind of got my start in this research discipline while I was in graduate school when I worked with a couple of neuroscientists who were interested in writing a popular science book on the neuroscience of magic. This book is called Sleights of Mind, and I was an advisor to the authors of that book throughout the time that they were writing it. I gave them magic lessons, and I contributed some pieces to the book. And it was the kind of attention that book garnered that persuaded me that there's actual meat on this scientific bone of the science of magic, that I can actually build a career upon insights gleaned from performing magicians. And so that's really what spurred my current research program. And I give credit to them for much of my success in the field, for giving me a firm foundation upon which to build. And nowadays, I'm a contributor to the greater science of magic movement. We've now, there are scientists around the world now who have taken interest in the methods of magicians as a tool for forwarding our understanding of the mind. And we have enough folks that we now have an organization, the Science of Magic Association, which Don mentioned in my introduction. And in fact, last month, we hosted our third biennial conference in London at Goldsmiths, University of London. And it was a great success, and I didn't catch COVID. All right, so here's the plan for today. Today's presentation comes in 2 acts with an overture. I'll begin by giving you a little bit of a history lesson on prior interactions between scientists and magicians. It's a relatively untold story that has some fascinating twists and turns. Act 1 will, in Act 1, I will describe how magicians manipulate your perceptions of the world and what those techniques have contributed to science. And in Act 2, I'll tell you about some of my work studying attention through the lens of performance magic. But before we do that, I suspect you're wanting to see some magic. You shouldn't get your hopes up too much. I am not a Zoom magician, so this won't be groundbreaking magic that you'll see, but it will give us a shared experience that we can use to unpack some of what I'm up to. So I guess I should have warned Don about this. Is there someone with a camera on who would like to help me out with something, who wouldn't mind showing up on the video? Anybody want to play? I promise it won't be embarrassing. It might even be fun. Oh, somebody raised their hand.
Joel raised his hand. So can you
all right.
Get to Joel?
Would you mind spotlighting Joel alongside me and allowing Joel to unmute his microphone?
Joel can unmute his microphone himself. So, but Joel, there you are. Can you unmute yourself?
All right.
Joel?
Hi, Joel.
Hello, Tony.
Thank you for your willingness to contribute today. We're going to try something a little bit weird. But before we do that, I brought along a pack of my business cards. I don't know why they give academics business cards. I have exactly no use for these things. They just pile up. So I do magic with them instead. And in fact, they're so old, they still say assistant professor of psychological science on them. But Joel, we are not in cahoots, correct? We didn't arrange anything ahead of time. And in fact, we've never met. Is that correct?
Well, as far as I know, but I have been to Wisconsin, so we may run into each other at some time.
Right.
But
perhaps
not so I recall.
All right, great. I'm gonna just make note of some things here. So Joel's your first name. I'm gonna put a J on there. Joel, what's your last name?
Schuster. S.
With an S. Okay, so I'm gonna put your initials, JS, on this business card, so we know that this is the business card that we've been working with all along. Also, give me a 4-letter word, a clean one.
Can I use 5 letters?
5's fine, yeah.
Vinci.
V-I-N-C-E?
V-I-N-C-I.
V-I-N-C-I, all right. I will put that there too, so that we know that this is happening in the moment, that this is not set up, that this is totally spontaneous. And in fact, I'm going to draw some random squiggles on the other side of this business card. So this is what we have here. One of a kind business card, a business card unlike any business card that has ever existed in the world. And I'm going to fold this business card in half, and it will not leave your sight for the duration of this magic trick. All right, Joel, let's do something weird now. Around my head, you should now see one suit of a deck of playing cards. I picked spades at random, could have been any suit. And Joel, I want you to simply think of one of these cards. And again, the suit doesn't matter, just the value. Think of ace or 4 or 10, any one. Do you have one in mind?
I do.
All right, Joel. I would like you to touch your computer monitor. Put your finger right on that ace up there. And so I could have impacted the card that you chose, right? Like the words that I'm using could have biased you towards one card over others. There could have been subtle suggestion involved. So we're going to add a little bit of randomness here. Whatever card you're thinking of, I want you to spell it. Spell the card while moving your finger clockwise around this circle, one card per letter in the word. So if you were thinking of ace, you'd go A, C, E, and it would put you on the 3. If you were thinking of king, you'd go K, I, N, G, and it'd put you on the 4. This is hard to do in mirror. But you're spelling, you're not counting. So do that now, Joel, for me. Okay, so now your finger is on a card. Probably not the card you're thinking of. We've injected a little randomness into this process. Whatever card your finger is on now, I want you to spell that one, continuing clockwise around the circle. So if you landed on the 3, you'd go T, H, R, E, E, and so on and so forth.
Okay.
So we're getting more and more random, further and further away from the card you originally thought of. Let's do it one more time. Whatever card your finger's on right now, spell that one, continuing clockwise around the cards. All right. Are you still with me, Joel?
I am.
Okay. So let's recap what's happened here. You thought of a random card. We injected some randomness by doing this spelling procedure. And now your finger is on a card that you didn't anticipate touching or maybe even thinking about. I doubt it's the original card you thought of, but who knows? For the first time, Joel, what card is your finger on at this point in time?
10.
The 10. All right. Well, I think we failed a little bit here, Joel, but that's okay, because the card that we started with still has your initials and your word on it, but the squiggles have now transformed into something of a prediction, which was the king. So we didn't get that right. That's okay. I'll explain more about this later on. But let's just imagine that it was the king, and we'll come back to that later. Yeah, I told you not to get your hopes up too much about this magic. Just out of curiosity, was anybody else playing along? No. Okay, well, spoiler alert, it's a mathematical thing. And no matter what card you think of at the start, after 3 rounds of spelling, it should converge on the king. It's known as the Kruskal principle, and we'll return to this in a little bit later. But really the thing that I wanted you to notice was the changing of the writing of the card. That's going to become psychologically interesting later on. Thank you for your help, Joel. I really appreciate it. Let me go back into the presentation now. Thanks, Don.
Okay, I'm going to unmute Joe.
Okay.
You already, Joe's trying to unspotlight Joe.
All right. Okay, so before we actually talk about the psychology behind the bad magic you've just seen, I want to give you a little bit of history. So I'm certainly not the first psychologist to take an interest in the methods of magicians. In fact, some of the first psychologists to think about the techniques of magic did so in the last decade of the 1800s. And in fact, during this one decade of the 1800s, during the 1890s, there were no fewer than 4 major publications by prominent psychologists of the era on the methods of magicians. These are names that probably would be familiar to you, even if you weren't a psychology major in college. The first one, okay, you don't know this guy, Max Dessoir. He wrote in 1893, The Psychology of the Art of Conjuring. If you do know Max Dessoir, it's because he coined the term parapsychology. That's what he's really famous for. Here's a name you've probably heard of, Alfred Binet. He's famous for his intelligence testing, right? You've probably heard of the Stanford Binet intelligence test. Well, in 1894, he published this lengthy treatise called The Psychology of Prestidigitation, where he carried out some of the very first research with performing magicians. And in fact, he's credited with capturing the first moving pictures of a performing magician in service of this research. Joseph Jastrow, Wisconsinites are usually familiar with Joseph Jastrow. He founded the famous psychology department at the University of Wisconsin. Prolific visual perception researcher. A lot of the visual illusions that you see had some basis in the work of Joseph Jastrow. And in 1896, he brought 2 of the world's most famous magicians into his laboratory at the University of Wisconsin and put them through this battery of tests. His hypothesis was that because these magicians are so adept at deceiving the senses, perhaps their sensory systems will be more acute, more sensitive than average. Spoiler alert, they weren't, but it was a cute idea. And finally, Norman Triplett, another lesser-known psychologist, although he's also credited with carrying out the first experiment in social psychology. And he completed his dissertation under the guidance of a famous psychologist, G. Stanley Hall, on the psychology of magic. Okay, so what was going on in this one decade of the 1800s that brought about all of this interest in the methods of magicians? Well, I'm going to give you my take on it, and it's certainly not the whole story. There's a lot more going on. There was a strange confluence of events in the 1800s that led to this interest. So first up, in the 1700s, this fellow Franz Anton Mesmer hypothesized about the use of animal magnetism to cure ailments. Mesmer believed that there are these mysterious energies flowing throughout the entire world that enter our bodies and that are the basis of our health. And so if you are unwell, it's probably due to something that's sort of pinching off that mysterious fluid in your body. And he called these fluids animal magnetism. He believed that my animal magnetism could impact your animal magnetism, and through the laying on of hands, we could redistribute these energies and cure you of your ills. Well, while people were under Mesmer's influence, while they were mesmerized, they claimed to have all sorts of impressive experiences. They claimed that they'd traveled to different places and times, that they'd communed with angels or with ghosts, that they could see the future. Well, these notions from Mesmer really made their way to the United States in the middle of the 1800s and were really catching on. And in fact, I mean, little seeds of mesmerism are still alive and well in the practices of chiropractors. Chiropractic was in large part based on principles of animal magnetism from mesmerism. Palmer, who founded chiropractic quote-unquote medicine, was deeply influenced by the pseudoscientific thinking of Franz Anton Mesmer. Okay, so meanwhile, in upstate New York, probably not so far from you folks, Kate and Margaret Fox, a couple of sisters, began hearing mysterious rapping noises coming from underneath the floorboards of their cottage. They came to realize that they were communicating with the spirit of a peddler who'd been murdered and buried in their cellar. They realized they could begin asking questions of this ghost, who would respond with these loud rapping noises. 1 rap for yes, 2 raps for no. And they promptly took the show on the road. They traveled all over the United States, carrying out seances where people in the audience could ask questions of the spirits, who would respond with these mysterious rapping noises. Later on, it came out that they were cheating. Not surprisingly, it was deceptive. They came up with all sorts of creative ways to create these ethereal rapping noises, the most creative of which being that they'd learned to crack the knuckles in their toes very loudly, creating this click that you couldn't really localize to any specific spot. Pretty effective. But even though one of the sisters had come clean, it was too late. You couldn't put the toothpaste back in the tube. They'd already founded a religion. The religion of spiritualism that had taken hold all across the United States. That's still alive and well in the pseudopsychics you see all over your television set, claiming to speak with the spirits. So all of this was happening in the mid-1800s, and psychologists of the era saw this happening. Right? Like they were part of popular culture. They were aware of what was going on, and they realized it sort of behooved them to look into the veracity of these claims that were being made by mesmerists and by spiritualists. If there was any reality to these claims, they'd be pretty beneficial for scientists to be aware of. Pretty big implications if Kate and Margaret Fox can actually speak with the dead, or if mesmerism can lead to your consciousness traveling to different locations and times. And so, in 1884, a group of scientists teamed up to create the American Society for Psychical Research that made it their mission to get to the heart of these claims, these seemingly paranormal claims that were being made by all manner of folks. And some of the founding members of this group include names you've already heard in this presentation: Max Dessoir and Joseph Jastrow. Other notables included William James, who wrote the first psychology textbook, and G. Stanley Hall, who was Norman Triplett's graduate advisor. Well, within a decade of the founding of this group, all of these men would have jumped ship. Well, these 3 men, not William James, jumped ship on the organization, because very quickly the organization had become something other than what they had intended for it to be. Rather than using the tools of science to gain an understanding of reality, it seemed that many members of the organization were interested in finding evidence to support their quirky views of the world, which is not what science is all about. And so these fellows jumped ship from the organization, and they turned their attention to magicians. If Kate and Margaret Fox were using deceptive techniques to produce the phenomena in their seances, it wasn't really in their best interest to come clean to scientists, right? Like scientists could ask all the questions that they wanted, but Kate and Margaret Fox were making bank on spiritualism. So it did not behoove them to be honest with the scientists. However, to use the words of Jamie Ian Swiss, magicians are honest liars. They say they're going to lie to you, and then they do. So perhaps magicians would be more forthright with scientists about methods that could be used, natural methods that could be used to produce phenomena like the spiritualists were producing. And perhaps those insights from magicians could give us some deeper understanding of psychology. Well, that's what I believe led to all of these publications. But in the 20th century, this all but disappeared. And that's because there was a revolution in psychology, the so-called behaviorist revolution, that insisted that psychologists limit their studies to behaviors that are directly observable and measurable. Behaviorists deemed the mind to be a black box into which we cannot peer. Well, all this science and magic stuff was inside the black box, right? Like it was the stuff of thought, which was pushed off the table of valid scientific inquiry. So This interest in the methods of magicians all but vanished for much of the 20th century until basically the 1990s, when cognitive psychologists like me had developed all manner of techniques to begin peering into the black box of the mind, behavioral techniques that allowed us to assess what was happening in between stimulus and a response, the two things that the behaviorists limited us to studying. So in the last 20 years, we've seen a renaissance in scientific interest in the methods of magicians. We've seen not just popular media articles about the science of magic, but we've seen scads of peer-reviewed, published research papers exploring the techniques of magicians. One of the early initiatives of the Science of Magic Association was to sponsor a special issue of Frontiers in Psychology devoted to the science of magic, and that all of the works in that special issue are still available online. And as of just the other day, they have about 600,000 downloads. So we're doing well there. And we have a new special section of the journal Psychology of Consciousness coming out just next month that includes 4 papers by folks in this research area that speak in some way to consciousness, including one from me. Okay, so that brings us up to current day, where there's widespread interest in the methods of magicians, and scientists have had some success using these to speed up our rate of scientific discovery. So before I begin telling you about some of these findings, I do want to communicate to you how difficult this is, right? Psychologists are trying to mine folk psychology, right? Like magicians, while sort of thinking like psychologists, don't have to write about their thinking the same way that psychologists do, right? Magicians also don't need to know why their techniques work. They only need to know that they work. So oftentimes the writings of magicians are simply inaccessible to scientists or lack the specificity that it takes to test these claims. So I'm going to do one little case study for you so that you can experience for yourselves how difficult this actually is. A term you've probably all heard used, and perhaps you've used it yourself, is misdirection. And every magician has some intuitive understanding of what this term means, which behaviors count as misdirection, but it is a rather ill-defined term. For example, here is one definition of misdirection from Lamont and Weissman. That which directs the audience toward the effect, what the audience is meant to experience, and away from the method, the secret techniques that allow the effect to occur. So as you can see, that's a really broad definition, right? Most people who aren't magicians, when they think of misdirection, think of having your attention drawn over here while the magician does something over here. But that's maybe one specific kind of misdirection, and maybe not a super effective kind of misdirection. The definition provided here is much broader. So in order to play armchair psychologist for a while, I'm going to play a little video for you, a video of me doing a magic trick. And your job is to try to become sensitized to all the techniques that I'm using to direct you toward the effect and away from the method. And we'll watch this video twice because it's my hope that the first time we watch it, you'll be fooled. But the second time we watch it, you'll probably see through all of the deceptions. So here we go. Let's watch this. The first time you watch it, just watch it. But the second time we watch it, I want you to be thinking about what I'm doing to misdirect you. So here we go.
Now, a master manipulator himself, go by the name of Magic Tony.
Magic Tony.
All right. What are you going to do for us first? What are you going to show us?
Well, I thought since tonight's show is all about science, maybe we should do a quick and dirty experiment. Would you like to play?
Sure. Why not?
All right. So I've got a deck of playing cards here. I'm going to run my thumb down the edge of the deck, and I just want you to tell me to stop anywhere you like.
Stop.
Right there. All right. You've selected the card. I'm going to show it to you. I'm going to show it to the camera. I'm not going to look at the monitor. I promise.
All right.
So you had a free choice of any card in the deck. So we're going to try a quick experiment. So some people think that crystals hold some power. They think that they can magnify telepathic energy. So I thought, if one crystal has this much power, why don't we try 10,000 crystals?
All
See if
right.
we can really amp this up. So I spared no expense, and I brought along 10,000 crystals with me this evening.
Okay.
So what I want you to do is concentrate on your card. And I want you to send the thought of the card to the base of the salt shaker. It'll shoot up through those crystals. It'll be magnified. It'll shoot out those holes, and it'll hit me right in the brain. Yeah, we could wish for a larger target. Sure. But...
I'm focusing. I'm
Oh,
concentrating.
right. You got it.
I'm seeing it.
Ooh, ooh, getting something. Your card is the color of a cherry. Is this correct? A black cherry.
There we go. Yeah.
It's, ooh, that was close.
Yeah.
It's a club. Is it a club? In fact, is your card the ace of clubs?
It is
All right.
the ace of
So
clubs.
that's amazing. But what's even more amazing is that if you look through the deck, in fact, you will not find an ace of clubs. There's no ace of clubs in this deck of cards because that's the card that I keep underneath the salt shaker.
All
Your
right.
ace of clubs.
Oh, that's fantastic. Okay. Now,
All right. So just out of curiosity, did anyone see how the card arrived under the salt shaker? I'm not seeing any hands. Okay, well, you will next time. Okay, so we're going to watch the critical moments of the video again. But this time, I want you to be attuned to what I'm doing that counts as misdirection. What are the behaviors that I'm engaging in that direct the audience away from the method and toward the effect? So I want you to also be sensitized to when I get the card under the salt shaker. Keep an eye out for that. And this is a little harder to detect when I actually figure out what the card is. It was a free choice of a card. I didn't know what card was selected after it was picked. I had to, but I knew where it was in the deck. I'd gotten it to the top of the deck and I had to find a time to peek at it. So I want you to try to figure out when I peek at the card. It's a little hard to detect. All right, back to the video.
So what I want you to do is concentrate on your card. And I want you to send the thought of the card to the base of the salt shaker. It'll shoot up through those crystals. It'll be magnified. It'll shoot out those holes, and it'll hit me right in the brain. Yeah, we could wish for a larger target. Sure. But...
I'm focusing. I'm
Oh,
concentrating.
right. You got it.
I'm seeing it.
Ooh, ooh, getting something. Your card is the color of a cherry. Is this correct? A black cherry.
There we go. Yeah.
It's, ooh, that was close.
Yeah.
It's a club. Is it a club? In fact, is your card the ace of clubs?
It is the ace.
So that's amazing. But what's even more amazing is that if you look through the deck, in fact, you will not find an ace of clubs. There's no ace of clubs in this deck of cards because that's the card that I keep underneath the salt shaker.
All right, you saw it that time, didn't you? I hope you saw it. Nope. Bob was just far too engaged in my story, right? He couldn't disengage. Okay, so what are some of your thoughts about behaviors I was engaged in that allowed you to be so readily deceived? You can put some things in the chat. Up to you. You have any thoughts? What were some of the things that I was doing? Well, I'll give you one right off the bat. Magicians are very sensitive to where they are looking, what their eyes are doing. Humans are very sensitive to social gaze cues, right? We use a person's eye movements to judge what's important in the environment around us. And so audience members are usually looking at the same spot that the magician's looking at. So I made sure that I wasn't looking at the salt shaker while I slid the card under there. My gaze was following the spreading of the deck so that the audience's gaze would follow that as well. Yeah, Jack says I pointed at the cards. Yeah, I spread the cards on the table. I pointed at the cards. You use all of those cues to determine where your attention will be placed. And in fact, you may not have processed it. I told you explicitly where to look. I said, and look, the card isn't in the deck. You're very good at following directions. So not only did you look at the spreading cards, but your attention was focused on the spreading cards. Yeah, focused on conversation. Narrative is the strongest tool that a magician has in his or her arsenal. I was using all manner of narrative to encourage you to place your attention at some locations over others, right? You didn't know that the card was going to vanish from the deck and appear under the salt shaker until I drew your attention to the fact that it had. If I'd told you ahead of time that the card was going to appear under the salt shaker, everybody would have caught me. You thought that it was a mind reading trick. You didn't know it was a trick where the card was going to vanish from the deck and appear elsewhere. Another piece of the conversation that's really a helpful tool of misdirection is humor. Magicians have the intuition that the moment an audience understands a joke, they're briefly blinded to the world around them. There are competing hypotheses for why this might be the case. My personal hypothesis is that jokes require you to access the contents of working memory. Right? Jokes have this pattern. They have a setup, they have a punchline. The setup creates an expectation. The punchline doesn't match that expectation. So the only way to make sense of the punchline is to travel back in time and reinterpret the setup in light of these new constraints. That's a working memory task. So I believe that humor works as misdirection because it forces audience members to focus their attention inward toward working memory to allow them to understand the joke. And in fact, it was the conversation, it was the joke that I used to get an opportunity to peek at the top card of the deck. I did that dumb joke about the card, the thought of the card hitting me right in the brain. We could wish for a bigger target. And after I made the joke, I did this kind of action, a squaring of the deck. And while I was squaring the deck, I kicked out the top card so I could get a little look at it. It looks just like this. This is very fast. But there was a very fortuitous thing that happened during that performance. The producer also judged that that was a moment in time where nothing important was happening, and he could cut to the host of the show. He could switch the camera to the host of the show at that moment. So that made it all the more difficult for anyone to detect me peeking at the card. Okay, so you can see there are lots of different behaviors that fall under this umbrella of misdirection, but they're all tapping into different cognitive processes. It's not just distraction. It's not just look over here while I do something subtle over here. So here is my incomplete list of some of the features of my behavior that count as misdirection in the trick that you just saw. Certainly the narrative. You're looking where you expect important things to be. The false climax, right? I palmed the card off the top of the deck just after I revealed the card that he was thinking of. You thought the trick was over. And so you relaxed your attention, and that was an opportunity for me to do a little sleight of hand and palm that card off the top of the deck. Gaze following, complex language processing, attentional capture by motion. I made this big sweeping motion, spreading the cards on the table. Those big actions capture an audience's attention. Okay, so now that you have a sense of why this is rather hard to study and oftentimes hard to put into testable terms, let me tell you about some of the work that I've done in the laboratory, exploring some of these methods of magicians. So let's go to Act 1. Gosh, we came a long way before we've even hit Act 1. I apologize. Manipulating perception. Okay, so we've come to the part of the presentation that you've all been looking forward to. Now you would like to know, how is every magic trick accomplished? And I am going to tell you. Every magic trick is accomplished through exploiting psychological tendencies and attentional limitations. There you go, that's it. We're done here. Okay. Yeah, so magicians are exploiting your psychology. I'm going to give you some concrete examples of how they're exploiting your psychology. And I want to begin with a magic trick that you're all familiar with, that was used to terrorize you as a child by probably an uncle. The trick where he removed his thumb tip thusly. Yeah, Not a great trick, but it terrorized you when you were a child. And the psychological tendency that's exploited in that magic trick, I believe to be the most frequently exploited psychological tendency in all of magic. But before I tell you about that, a little story. So you're driving through rural New York or wherever, and you see this alongside the road. You extract a lot of information from the scene. You think it's pretty cute that that cow is interested in the duckling, but you're not aware of all of the assumptions that your visual system is making based on incomplete information. For example, you probably don't question for a moment whether or not that cow has a midsection. You can't see her midsection. It's obscured by the fence post, but you know it's there. And beyond just knowing it's there, we have evidence that your visual system actively fills in the occluded region of that cow so that you can arrive at a complete perception of that cow. You keep driving, you see this. You're not sure what to make of it. Some jokers nailed some sticks to the back of a tree stump. But again, your visual system begins making assumptions to interpret what it's experiencing. And probably your initial interpretation is that those are two roughly straight sticks crossing over each other behind that tree stump. This is a place where your perceptual system makes arguably an unfound assumption. It's likely, it's simple, but in this case, it's not the correct interpretation. Instead, it's two curved sticks nailed to the back of that tree stump. Now, why did you not consider for a moment this arrangement of those sticks? Well, because perception is calibrated by experience. And when you jump to conclusions based on incomplete information, the conclusions that you jump to are the simplest interpretations and the most likely interpretations given prior experience. These curved sticks in this perfect position, it's not simple, it's not likely. So our perceptual systems are biased toward interpretations that are both simple and likely, and we adopt these assumptions, these interpretations, automatically and mostly outside of consciousness. And that is a recipe for a psychological tendency that magicians can exploit. You can feel it happening. It's going to happen. You're going to feel it. Here it comes. Yeah. For just the briefest moment, you perceived like a 15-foot cow. That your initial interpretation was to fill in the occluded region of a single cow, but then consciousness took the reins and said, nope, that's impossible. And then you began coming up with alternative hypotheses that included two cows. But that initial interpretation is the one that magicians can take advantage of. And early psychologists around the turn of the 20th century were beginning to be aware of some of these unconscious assumptions that our visual system makes when presented with incomplete information. There was a group of psychologists who called themselves the Gestaltists. Gestalt is a German word that basically means organized whole. And their mantra was that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, that perceptions aren't just constructed through combining basic features of the world, but that there's some guesswork involved, that you're making guesses to complete visual forms. And the Gestaltists made it their work to kind of laundry list. What are the assumptions that your visual system makes when presented with incomplete information? One of them that they landed on is called Gestalt good continuation. That when you're filling in occluded regions of a visual stimulus, you do so in a way that respects smooth continuity over abrupt change. Here's an example of it. This is from Gestalt speech perception researcher Albert Bregman. Here's a bunch of image fragments. Can you figure out what those images are? You probably can't, right? It's just a bunch of like meaningless image fragments. But the moment I provide you with an occluder, the moment I spill some ink on top of those image fragments, now Gestalt good continuation takes the reins. You begin filling in the occluded regions, and probably you now perceive those objects to be a bunch of uppercase B's, the letter B. So the information in the environment hasn't changed, right? The signal of those B's hasn't changed, but now you're encouraged to make guesses, to fill in the occluded region, and it allows you to arrive at a whole perception. Okay, so back to the dumb thumb trick. It only works if the magician adopts the arrangement in figure 2. Yep, you have to provide the audience with an occluder. You have to cover up part of the thumb, thus encouraging good continuation, filling in the occluded region in a way that respects smooth continuity over abrupt change. And then when you remove the thumb, perception and reality don't match, and that is the definition of an illusion. So this tendency, this exploiting Gestalt good continuation, it's everywhere in magic. And in fact, I used it for the card trick. So when you were presented with my business cards, you assumed them to be a bunch of whole business cards, partially occluded by a little rubber band. What you didn't realize is that I cut one of the cards in half. The top card was cut in half, and it was just slipped underneath the edge of the rubber band. So when I was writing Joel's initials on what seemed to be the top card, I was really writing them on the second card from the top. And I put his sort of random word here, and I put those little scribbles over there. Well, on the second business card, I'd previously written the word king, because the mathematical algorithm of that dumb trick leads everybody to the king after 3 rounds of spelling. So when I removed the card, what you thought it was the top card, I was really removing the second card from the top and then folding it over. So this is Gestalt good continuation. You filled in the business card behind that occluder so that you perceived one whole business card rather than a weird half a business card on top of a bunch of normal business cards. And that arrangement, by the way, the half business card, it's unlikely, it's complicated. So your visual system wouldn't consider it for even an instant. The linking rings trick, one of the classics of magic, and I think one of the weakest magic tricks of all time. The premise of the trick is that you have these solid silver rings that are linking together. The trick only works if the audience assumes that the rings are in fact solid. The moment the audience thinks that there might be a gap in one of the rings, the trick falls apart. Well, if hypothetically there was a gap in one of the rings, where would that gap live? Well, it would live behind the magician's hand, because it would encourage the audience to fill in a completed ring behind the magician's hand, given the law of Gestalt good continuation. Heck, this even applies to grand illusions. Here's the zigzag lady illusion, a classic illusion. The woman's put in the box, they put some blades through, they slide her midsection off to the side, and it's an impossibility. Well, this asks a lot of the audience, right? Like, you don't have a lot of information about how her body is positioned inside that box. You have her face, you have her right and left hand, you have her left foot, and that's it. And so, in order to encourage the audience to fill in her body in a way that allows the magic trick to occur, they put that silhouette on the outside of the box. The silhouette forces your perceptual system to adopt one interpretation of the position of her body, and it precludes your ability to consider alternative ways her body could be positioned in that box that will allow this illusion to occur. For funsies, I wanted to see what would happen if I photoshopped out the silhouette. And perhaps your experience is that the trick is weakened substantially. I mean, it's still pretty good. It's still kind of hard to imagine how her body could be positioned in that box, but the trick itself becomes much less effective. In fact, here they are side by side. Perhaps you experience that the illusion on the left is a lot more powerful than the illusion on the right, because on the right, your perceptual system is freed up to come up with alternative hypotheses for the positioning of her body. Okay, so I could go on all day about this. I've written a bunch on Gestalt good continuation and how it is exploited by magicians, but I'd like to turn my attention to something different now. I am going to present you with a video, a very brief video, no audio there. You're going to watch the video, and afterwards I'm going to ask you some questions about what you've seen. All right, here we go. All right, the question is, where was the coin when last you saw it? Was it under the left napkin here, or was it under the right napkin here? What do you think? And the correct answer would be here, under the left napkin. Now, if that was not your perception, how did you go wrong? Well, we'll watch it again. And now I want you to focus your attention on the middle of the mat. Pay no attention to the action, none of the narrative that I'm presenting to you. Focus all of your attention on the middle of that placemat. Here we go. Aha! There it was. Some of you saw it. Some of you saw it move the first time. I doubt all of you saw it the first time. So this brings us to Act 2, the manipulation of attention by magicians. This phenomenon that some of you have just experienced, some of you didn't, is known as inattentional blindness, our tendency to miss a salient event, something that happens right in front of our face, if our attention isn't appropriately focused upon it. Perhaps you are familiar with the invisible gorilla demonstration from Dan Simons and Christopher Chabris, where there are a bunch of basketball players passing basketballs around. Your job is to count how many times the players wearing white shirts pass the basketball while ignoring players in black shirts. And a gorilla comes out on the stage, beats its chest, and walks off the other side. About half of people miss the gorilla completely. Well, I often say it's rare to be at a basketball game and miss a gorilla walking across the court, but it's not so rare to be at a magic show and miss all sorts of things that are happening right in front of your face. So I was among the first to use magic as a tool for studying inattentional blindness. So I want to tell you about one of the experiments that I've carried out using this magic trick, borrowed straight from the world of magic, but done in a way that is unfamiliar to most. So we got people into the lab and we had them watch video of this magic trick, although they didn't know that it was a magic trick. They just thought that they were coming into an experiment about eye movements, because we had them in an eye tracker, a device that monitors their eye movements and tells us exactly what they're looking at every moment in time. And we had two conditions in this experiment. In what I'm calling the no preview condition, they experienced exactly what you experienced. The very first video that they watch had the coin move from one location to the next. In the preview condition, they watched 3 videos that had all the same actions. The coin was put down, the napkins, the cups, but the coin didn't move. And at the end of every trial, they were asked, where was the coin when last you saw it? On the 4th trial, the coin moved. Now, why did we do this? Why did we have these 2 conditions? Well, there were competing hypotheses. One hypothesis from the world of magic and one hypothesis from the world of psychology. Let me tell you about them. So here's on the top here is my favorite magic theorist. He was not a scientist. He was a magician, Arturo de Ascanio. He was father of the Spanish School of Magic. Spaniards have a very impressive approach to magic, thanks to Ascanio. They really do approach their magic like scientists, trying to evaluate every decision that they're making as performers to strengthen the magic. And Ascanio talked about something he called the natural conditioning hypothesis. He said that if you're going to do some kind of deceptive action, like the vanish of a coin, by only pretending to transfer the coin from one hand to the other, you should condition the audience to accept that action as natural by actually transferring the coin from one hand to the other a few times. And then when you do the deceptive action, they will erroneously group the deceptive action with the non-deceptive actions and be fooled to their extent. So Ascanio would say that because of natural conditioning, participants in my experiment should be deceived to a greater extent after they've been lulled into submission by these 3 control trials where the coin didn't move. So Ascanio predicted that repetition of these non-deceptive trials should increase rates of inattentional blindness in the preview condition relative to the no preview condition. On the bottom is Levy, Nilly Levy, a prolific psychological scientist who has her own theory of attention called perceptual load theory. And her theory predicts exactly the opposite. I'm going to do a disservice to her theory. It's too complicated to really describe the minutiae of right now. But basically, she considers attention to be this resource, this limited resource that you're trying to optimally divide between pressures. Think about how much attention it would take to process everything on the very first trial of that experiment. You don't know what's going to be relevant. You don't know what question you're going to be asked after the video plays. So you're trying to process everything. It is highly demanding. It is, she would call it a high perceptual load task. But with every subsequent trial, the perceptual load gets smaller because the participants can kind of key into what's relevant and what's irrelevant. They can more optimally divide their attention between the things that seem to be informative. And so Lavie predicts that there should be greater inattentional blindness in the no preview condition than in the preview condition, because the preview condition allows you to kind of focus your attention more optimally. So what do you think? Who's right here? Do you think Ascanio was right? Or do you think Lavie was right in the context of this magic trick? Well, we got our participants. We put them in the eye tracker, monitoring their eye movements. We did the experiment just as I described it. In the no preview condition, about half of participants detected the moving coin. So if the coin moved on the very first video, in the very first trial, only about half of participants detected it. However, when they had those preview trials, rates of inattentional blindness went down substantially. Only 6 of 34 people missed the coin. That supports Lavie's perceptual load theory and refutes Ascanio's natural conditioning hypothesis. I'll say when I went into this, I thought for sure Ascanio would be right in this context. I thought this would be a place where we'd be disproving Lavie. And boy, howdy, was I wrong. And that's more fun, frankly. So you probably wonder why we were monitoring eye movements. Well, we wanted to see if there was any relationship between inattentional blindness and eye movements. And as it turns out, if we looked at where people's eyes were fixated while the coin was moving, we couldn't tell who had seen the coin and who hadn't. People who detected the coin were looking at roughly the same spots as people who didn't see the coin. This is a messy graphic, but the yellow dots are people who detected the coin. The white dots are people who didn't. And with the exception of the 2 jokers at the very bottom, those dots are perfectly on top of each other. Statistically, there was no difference between groups. But if we zoom out on that video and look at eye movements over the duration of the video, we do see some differences between people who detected the coin and those who didn't. So here is a video. The pink dot represents where a participant's looking. And these are the eye movements of a person who's going to miss the coin. You can see they're tracking the action and they're very interested in that cup. Their attention and their eye movements move with the cup, and they completely miss the coin moving below. And when they're asked where the coin was, they respond and they're told they were incorrect. Participants who detected the coin, on the other hand, I think that's what this video is, if it's playing appropriately, still tracked the action, but their attention was less captured, less locked in to that first cup. And you see that they very quickly fixate, their eyes move to the end point of the coin's movement or the space in between those napkins. They spend less time fixating on the cup. So the difference here seems to be in where their attention is placed independently of their eye movements. The people who didn't detect the coin moving had their attention firmly aligned with where their eyes were pointed. The people who did detect the coin dissociated their attention from their eye movements. Their eyes were pointed at the cup, but their attention must have been down here, allowing them to detect the moving coin. So, this points to an important phenomenon. We use eye trackers often to make assumptions about people's attention, but attention and eye movements are not perfectly mapped onto each other. In fact, all the evidence suggests that your attention moves to a new location before your eyes move to that location. So there's this dissociation between attention and eye movements. And in fact, your attention can move to a few different locations before you program an eye movement to any of those locations. So perhaps we need to be a little more guarded about the inferences we're making about attention based on eye movements. So some conclusions before we can turn to questions. Magicians certainly exploit psychological tendencies that are adaptive in the real world. Why are you fooled by things like the linking rings or this thing with the rubber band? Well, because these assumptions that you make are right most of the time. The simplest, likeliest explanation is probably the right one. That's Occam's razor. And so through years and years of experience in the world, you've developed predictive mechanisms that are very accurate in the real world. But in the context of a magic show, those assumptions can be used against you. Further, hopefully I've convinced you today that magicians are indeed informal cognitive scientists. They have to have hypotheses about the mind in order to develop techniques to deceive those minds. And those hypotheses are mostly untested by psychology. So through testing these ideas from folk psychology, we can speed up our rate of scientific discovery in formal psychological science. So really, the moral of the story is that if you want to go to a magic show and not be fooled, you should turn off your assumptions. You should stop being Bayesian, letting prior experience dictate current perceptions. Only then will you be unencumbered by the baggage that comes from a lifetime of experience with the world. And good luck with that, because that is impossible. So thank you for your kind attention and sweet dreams.
Tony, thank you very much.
All
It's a very interesting presentation. Yes, I didn't see the coin move the first time. Michelle did ask,
Good.
how did the coin move besides it being magic?
I probably had better not tell you. I better not tell you that method. It's not my method to teach. I don't want to get blackballed for that. I'll get blackballed for something, but I don't want to get blackballed for that one. But if you want to find out, it's in a book. It's not a magnet. The method is published in this very book, Close Up and Personal by David Regal. Maybe at your local library, but probably not.
Who knows? Again, thank you. Michelle had another question about a couple things. She's pointed out she remembers the thumb trick also has got your nose.
Yep, that works too. Yep. Maybe even more terrifying, quite frankly.
True.
Since,
And the
yeah.
So Michelle also had a question. The woman saw it in half. How did they make the silhouette at the last moment?
No. The silhouette was on the box the entire time. I just photoshopped it out. Yeah. Yep. So that another place where this Gestalt good continuation comes into play is in the sawing in half illusion, where a person goes in the box and you put a saw through the middle and separate their halves. That trick only works if the audience perceives the head coming out of one end of the box as belonging to the same body as the feet coming out of the other end of the box. Well, that's a lot of like occluded body. That's a big ask for the audience to assume that it's one body connecting the head and the feet. And so the magicians, again, have to come up with little suggestions that get the audience to adopt the interpretation that they want them to. What do? They put these little doors on the side of the box, and they can open up one door and you see like the side of her arm, and you open up the other door and you see the side of a leg. It doesn't preclude alternative interpretations, but it's enough of a suggestion to the audience that their perceptual systems can't work out on the fly a way that the head and the body couldn't belong to the same body.
Mm-hmm. Myron made a comment. I'm going to have to ask Myron to unmute himself and explain, because I'm not sure I understand. Myron said, someone finally said, it's impossible. Myron, can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, what I really meant was kind of just a joke, but what I meant was, you hear from everyone to not let your past experiences dictate your present judgments. And you hear that all the time and all the time. But yeah, someone finally said it. It's actually really hard.
Yes, it's nearly impossible. And because it's so adaptive to let prior experience shape current cognition and perception, I very rarely have magicians gotten upset that I'm like giving away some of these secrets to students, right? I teach this whole cognitive science of magic course. And in the handful of times that I've had magicians kind of get upset that some of these secrets are being revealed, it's reminded me of how much expertise, how much experience it takes to be able to see how a magical method applied in one context can also be applied in another context. The students in my class, I'll do a cut and restored rope trick that exploits Gestalt good continuation. I'll show them exactly how I'm doing it as a tool to teach Gestalt good continuation. A magician will come into class the next day, do basically the same trick with the same method, but because they're a different person in a subtly different context with different narrative, my students will still be fooled by it. It highlights what educators call the myth of transfer. Oftentimes, learning itself is context dependent. And when you learn something in one context, it's very difficult to see how that learning can be applied to a new context. So it takes like years and years of experience with magic for you to really learn these methods and understand and be able to detect them across different contexts. So I've revealed a handful of secrets to you today, but I suspect the next time you see a magician using these methods in the wild, you'll still be fooled by them because it's so difficult to generalize your knowledge to a new environment, to a new performer, to a new context. Mm-hmm. So long story short, I don't think magicians need to be concerned about exposure because exposure doesn't lead to transferable knowledge most of the time.
Michelle asked a question again. Michelle, you may need to expand on this to make sure I get it right. Michelle asked, even with volunteers from the audience. Michelle, what were you referring to there?
I was still I'm thinking about the lady sawed in half. Like sometimes they pull people from the audience and they just put them in the box and the wedges in.
Yeah, different method on that one, right? Like the person that comes up from the audience is not in on it, and they don't have to do anything special with their bodies. It's a completely different method. So the person from the audience doesn't know what happened and can't help the audience figure it out later. I mean, there are certainly some tricks where the person brought up from the audience starts out naive, gets a lot of information on the fly, and is discouraged from telling the audience what their experience was because it'll ruin everything. But those situations are few and far between in magic.
Okay.
Oh, I don't see any other questions in the comments. Tony, you've amazed us all. One thing I did like you said was that something I believe very firmly is that as humans, we are lazy when it comes to our perceptions. We see stuff out there, and as long as it fits a pattern, that's good enough. We will forget all about the details if they fall into that initial pattern. And where'd my thumb go?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, the brain is a costly machine to keep running. And so we're cognitive misers. We get as many shortcuts and lazy decision-making processes as possible to reduce energy consumption by the brain. And we land on these sort of strategies that work most of the time until you're in a relatively artificial context like that of a magic show.
I like the way you say that we're lazy. I use the term, I admit I'm lazy, and I'm
Yeah,
glad to
we
hear
all
a
are. It's
professional
adaptive.
concur with that.
Well, Don, you are particularly lazy, frankly. Yeah.
I know, and I admit it all the time. Okay, so Michelle also said, to be more complicated, does anyone see David Copperfield switch panties with two young girls?
That doesn't
That's a
sound
trick I
like
haven't
David
seen.
Copperfield to me. That sounds like a recipe for a sexual harassment suit, which could happen.
Well, I saw it on live TV years ago.
Okay.
Years ago.
Yeah. There were two
Okay.
volunteers from the audience.
Yeah, you have to be very skeptical of television magic because you can't know what happened before the camera started running, and it's often hard to know if there were cuts along the way too.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, Tony, I want to thank you. It's been very informative, enlightening, and we got some entertainment and some laughs along the way too. I thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Hope you enjoyed it.